My name is Ruben Sarabi. I'm the founder and director of the American Public Trust. I'll be your host today, and I'm thrilled by your interest and engagement in this call, and frankly, the caliber of people on this room. The folks I know care deeply about their communities, and it's encouraging to be with you all today. So, quickly, the American Public Trust. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit institution that supports cities, counties, and states in applying the best of what's emerging in participatory, deliberative, and digital democracy methods to meet the challenges that matter most in their backyards. Our mission in a higher level is to renew our systems of governance so Americans can go beyond politics as usual and create better futures on our biggest challenges. We don't do this alone, as you can see with the co-sponsors of this event, part of an ecosystem of organizations that are collaborating together in service of very similar groups. So why do we do this work? Well, across all levels of governance in the country, I think it's not a leap to say we're experiencing increased political polarization, gridlock, and oftentimes breakdown of the social fabric in the worst cases. At the same time, communities face really, really tough issues that have incredible consequences, from housing and homelessness to water management, affordability. There's a growing sense that status quo approaches are not enough, that our governance and democracy must evolve to meet the unique challenges of our time. So, put simply, there's great wisdom in that old adage of united we stand, divided we fall. So, how can we find more united ways forward together on our toughest issues? How might we shift from seeing the public as a risk to be managed to a resource to be engaged? That's part of our collective. Citizen or civic assemblies, our focus today, are one of the innovations in a genre of collaborative governance that have a track record of taking on some of the most complex divisive issues and creating a common ground path forward. In a nutshell, you can think of them as a supercharged jury duty for tough public problems. They bring together a representative cross-section of the public, and they give them enough time, usually 40 hours, to learn about an issue and make recommendations on policy decisions to move the community. We are pleased to learn today about these assemblies with Peggy Flynn, the city manager of Petaluma, and Alex Renirie, co-lead of Healthy Democracy, who both played key roles in an assembly that was held in Petaluma in 2022. One of the most challenging issues. It's my honor to introduce Peggy, and maybe we could spotlight her as well. With nearly 30 years of public service, Peggy serves as the city manager of Petaluma, a vibrant and engaged community of 60,000 residents. I think you can see a lovely view of sunrise in the background there in Petaluma. And since her appointment in 2019, Petaluma successfully passed a 1-cent sales tax, which generates $18 million a year. This was a big deal, and attracted over $100 million in grants for community priorities. They launched the first 24/7 mobile crisis intervention program in the region, in addition to establishing this largest lottery selected channel in the US to reimagine their fairgrounds. And as Peggy added in the hashtag, Petaluma leads. Well, we're honored to be here with you, Peggy. Thank you for sharing with us. Maybe to start things off, just love to learn a little bit more about you and your role with a few questions. What does it mean to be the city manager of Petaluma? What are key roles and responsibilities?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you and to the American Public Trust, Ramin, for having me here. It's quite an honor. And for all of you who are participating and trying to make your communities better and better to serve your residents. To be the city manager of Petaluma, I live in Petaluma. To be the city manager of the city you live in is phenomenal. I call it's a mandate, not a job. You know, the city is an old city. We were established in 1858, incorporated in 1858. So we're an old city with old bones. You can see some of the historic fabric in our city, but we are changing. Our demographics are changing, our needs are changing, and we need to adapt. And so I have 7 council members, and I'm on my 3rd city council, and we do more 7-0 votes than I think most city councils, because we're all rowing in the same direction on the big things that affect our community. And so it's an honor every day. And like I said, definitely not a job. It's something I live and breathe 24/7.
Well, thank you for that. Now I'm curious. So if you think about wild success in the next 18 months in your role, what would that look like? What are the top three things that might indicate you've been super successful?
Well, when I first got here, I think the biggest challenge was our fiscal and organizational sustainability. We were facing bankruptcy. So, and we had two failed sales tax attempts before I got here. So it was getting the council, and it wasn't because the community didn't support us, but at that time, the council just couldn't agree on it. And so obviously the community wasn't going to support it. And we've come a long way since then. We passed the 1 cent sales tax during the pandemic. And it was because we went back out to the community and spent time talking about asking what the community wanted, and also sharing with them the cost of doing service as a 21st century city with $100 million of deferred maintenance and the dubious distinction of having the worst roads in the Bay Area. So we really, passing a 1 cent sales tax during the pandemic during such an uncertain time really required us to engage our community in a way that we hadn't before. And we have a really engaged community. I call it people powered Petaluma for a reason. And it was just re-engaging, strengthening those relationships, demystifying government. And we talk about transparency in government, but it was really about feet on the street, right? Like being out there, talking to folks, meeting people where they are, pulling the curtain back and saying, hey, this is the cost for services. We need your help. If we're going to provide the services you need, we need your help. So I think wild success is that every decision that council makes, that there's ownership and support by our residents. And that when we have those difficult community character conversations, that there is a trust built, that trust in the city that we're going to do the right thing because our community is engaged and their voice is being heard. I guess that would be the picture of success.
That really resonates. Thank you for that. Thank you for the we need to have another learning call on the journey that you took on that 1 cent sales tax. Well, to take one step to zoom back out, you talked about this not as a job, but as a mandate. And I know how full on this is. This is not 40 hours a week. Why of all the things in the world that you could be doing personally, your career, your work, have you chosen this?
I love this question when you sent this to me, Ramin, because I didn't know what a city manager was. When I was going through college, I was a journalism major. And I took my first local politics class, and the professor hooked me up with an internship to work for the largest redevelopment agency in California. And I was struck by the amazing amount of work we were doing. And, whether it was affordable housing or neighborhood revitalization, just the amazing work we were doing. And nobody knew about it. Council knew about it, but we were kind of into the community. And I kept saying, oh my gosh, we're doing such great work. We've got to tell, and they didn't have a communications person at the time. But I got so excited because local government is where we make the most change. It's tougher as you get up state and federal level, but in local government, you affect change immediately. And I was blown away by that and blown away by that level of responsibility. And true story, in that class, we did a mock, we called it Circleville, professor called it Circleville. And I was appointed as the city manager. I mean, talk about a foreshadowing of things to come. But the one thing the professor said, he said, well, you're facing a deficit of $200,000. I laugh now because we were facing $6.5 million deficit. But he said, well, what are you going to do? You've got a $200,000 deficit. And I just looked at him and I said, well, I just won't take a salary. And he comes running across his room and he goes, you can't do that. And I said, yeah, I can. I'm the city manager. And I think that public service is such a noble profession, and it has changed so much even after post-pandemic that it's in my blood. And I know the 400 staff that I have, it's in their blood too. So it's pretty amazing.
I'll reserve my Krista Tippett flavor of the question. Like if there's an aspect to your childhood for a side conversation that led to this. Thank you. I I sense the deep amount of meaning and joy that you get from doing this work. And again, it's an honor.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, now, if you were going to describe Petaluma to folks, Petaluma, I know we already talked about it's about 60,000 folks. How do you explain Petaluma in a nutshell?
Wow, we have such a rich, we are the southernmost city in Sonoma County. And if anybody understands this area, the next county over is Marin County, and then it's San Francisco. So we have that influence from the Bay Area. In the North Bay, we're called the North Bay. At the turn of the last century, we were considered the egg capital of the world. We had more chicken ranches than any city in the United States. And so we shipped eggs via Petaluma River to many places. So we have a large agrarian history in our community. But with that San Francisco influence, a lot of families have moved up here in the last few decades. And like I said, we're an old city, but the demographics are changing, the energy's changing, the needs are changing. And so we've got, and I feel like we have the best and the brightest in our city. No matter where I've traveled, somebody knows somebody from Petaluma. And whether you watched American Graffiti or Peggy Sue Got Married, we are the backdrop for a lot of those because we still have the historic fabric in our city that they could actually shoot those movies here. It's a beautiful city, and it's pretty progressive. It's a pretty progressive city.
And how would you, if you had to give a title to this chapter in Petaluma, what is this chapter of Petaluma about?
Well, I want to say it's our second renaissance because we went through a very hard time after the recession when I took over in 2019, and I told you about where we were financially. But we are a true full service city. We have an airport marina. We own our own transit. We run our own ambulance service, police, fire, everything. And our staffing levels were 16%, 2008 levels. And that was after we laid off 30% of our staff. So we weren't firing on all cylinders, and getting the 1 cent sales tax and starting to do the things not only to get us to back to baseline where we needed to be, but we are now leading because the community wants us to. The community expects a lot out of its government. And so I feel like we're in our second renaissance. I really do. And at the very start of that second renaissance. And it's an exciting time for our city.
You're making a compelling pitch for many of us maybe to move there. But
I was going to say, or want to come work for the city of Petaluma.
Well, before moving on to the fairgrounds, okay, so it's second renaissance, but what are some of the biggest challenges in going from here to there?
A lot of unresolved issues. The fairgrounds is a perfect example. In the 1950s, the fairgrounds was on the far east side of our city, so on the outskirts of our city. Because of growth, since then, it actually sits in the center of our city. It is literally dead center in our city, 55 acres, city owned. And it, over 50 years ago, we entered into a lease with the 4th District Agricultural Association, which is an arm of our California Department of Food and Ag, gubernatorial appointed board. They run a 5-day fair in our city, and it's called the Sonoma Marin Fair. And for the rest of the year, the property had been leased out for a variety of things to pay for their operations year round. The fair is revenue neutral, but outside of that, that was their funding mechanism, was this 55 acres. The city had no ability we had no land use control. We had, no jurisdiction on that property under this lease. And when I came on, the lease was getting ready to expire at the end of this past year. And so this conversation had never been a public conversation. Of all these years of the 50-year lease had never been a public conversation. It had always been in closed session. So, of course, the rumor mills were all about, and, in different times in the city's history, the property was a nest egg. If we were going to file bankruptcy, I'm certain that property would have been sold off in order to pay for basic services. So it was, what are we going to do when the lease runs out? And it was it was very contentious because you had to state controlled or managed property in the middle of the city. And it's, arguably one of the most valuable assets of our city outside of our residents and our staff. And it wasn't resolved and it had never been spoken about publicly. So that was one of the challenges outside of getting us into fiscal and organizational sustainability that I had to wrestle with.
So yeah, the fairgrounds, and I wonder if I've gotten it right. The way I came to see it is the question of what to do with it became contentious because on one hand, people deeply love the fair and the heritage that pointed to.
Absolutely.
And on the other hand, it was probably broadly felt that the land was underutilized in terms of being of service to the community. 55 acres, like you said, right in the middle of town and outside of that annual fair, not a lot going on, maybe an occasional large event and fenced up, So, what about trying to address this question of what to do felt so tough and what had been tried previously that wasn't working?
Well, I think the challenge was, just what you said was it was being, there was a belief that it had to stay in under state controlled management because the fair wouldn't exist otherwise. And they aren't mutually exclusive. Secondly, I think over all the years of not having intentional engagement around this property and what is the best and highest use for the community for this property was the rumor mill started. So, if a council member, said, I think we ought to build a hotel on it. Well, then that became the truth. Like, well, the city wants to build a hotel on it. And, it was just without having this transparency, without having this community conversation, it just became this huge urban legend. So by the time I got here, there was a binder and I still have it. It's, it's probably 7 inches thick, no joke. And it's got every bit of history of the fights between the state and the city about what to do with the property. And I kept saying, well, when did we talk to the community about it? And it's like, well, we've never talked about it in public. And I couldn't wrap my brain around that. And so just trying to tease all that out and get it to this most basic question of like, what do we as the Petaluma community, now that we have, especially now that we have the financial means to this is not no longer it's not a necessity to keep it in the back pocket in case we need to sell that property. What can we do now with that property now that the lease is getting set to expire and just really engaging our community on all sides and not letting special interest, whether it was the city or the DAA, to run those conversations.
Well, and that's a great segue because at some point, as I understand, you learned about civic assemblies, citizen assemblies, sometimes called lottery selected panels. There's a lot of names, by the way, for the larger
Never
audience.
knew about any of those things. Yeah.
Never heard about those.
No.
So you heard about it, and why did you think this could make a difference in Petaluma?
Well, as I mentioned, my background was communication. So, and I felt like we already had a really robust engagement program here at the city for, we just kicked off our general plan. We're doing a variety of really cool, we have dozens of committees and commissions here in the city. So we have a really robust public engagement. And I see Lynn Davis is here. So Lynn, you will always be just kind of that angel that dropped out of the universe. But I went to our state Cal Cities annual conference, and one of my council members told me about this breakout session. And a lot of times you get a lot of sell intels, like buy the new software and you can change your community, or here's the new widget. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go, but I wasn't my expectations were not super high. And I probably was in there 5 minutes, and it's no joke. And I was hearing Lynn talk about the work of healthy democracy. And I went, oh my gosh, that's the missing piece. That is going to be the process we need for our fairgrounds. And the reason I thought that was, how do we, as local government, get those voices that we've talked about this for decades. How do we hear from the people? How are, and yet we still hear from the same people who have the privilege of coming to a council meeting and staying till midnight, or having the ability or flexibility to serve on a committee or commission, or having the ability to serve as a council person. How do we get those folks to the table? And through this lottery selected panel or assembly, or all the different names that are out there for this that describe this concept, I thought, this is it. This is, I think, and I ran at the very end because I saw this line forming to, talk to Lynn. And I just I wasn't as polite as I should have been, but I kind of want to move past everybody and say, Lynn, you need to come to Petaluma. We need this. We need this now. And I think Lynn looked at me like, yeah, just put your name on the list and, we'll talk. And I thought, no, we've got to have this. And that was the start of a wild ride. And I never looked back.
Amazing. Thank you. And we have Lynn's co-lead, Alex, and that's a great segue to Alex. It's here that can share a bit more about the 101, if you will, of what these civic or citizen assemblies are, and take us into some of the nuts and bolts of the design of the Petaluma case. So I'll introduce Alex. Alex co-leads program development and process design at Healthy Democracy, which is a US-based nonpartisan nonprofit that brings together everyday people selected by these democratic lotteries to tackle tough policy questions. She co-coordinates Healthy Democracy's complex public processes and manages partnerships with practitioner groups in the US and abroad. Since 2019, she served on 4 projects like the Petaluma panel that we're discussing here in various capacities. And I know she's an in-demand speaker in a host of areas. So we're really grateful to have you here, Alex. I'll turn it to you.
Thank you so much, Ramin, and thank you all so much for being here today. Healthy Democracy, I had the pleasure of designing and implementing this process that you're hearing about from Peggy today. And as Ramin mentioned, I'm here to take us through kind of the nuts and bolts of how this process works. But before we dive into that, I'd love to start with a brief video clip that actually gives you a sense of what the process was like from the perspective of panelists themselves. So I'm going to cue that up.
Part of our job is to dream. And as a whole, I think we've been pretty good at that. And now we're narrowing it down to how those dreams fit together.
First thing is, you have 36 people, different backgrounds. Most of them who didn't know each other and were able to work together.
I think my favorite part of this process so far is the ability for everyone to speak and voice their opinion, and the ability for everyone in this panel together to accept that everyone's visions are different.
It's the politics the way it is, where they don't seem to want to communicate at all. And I think this is the perfect way to get politics not so political.
Wonderful. So now that we've heard from panelists, let's look at kind of 2 core elements that differentiate this type of process from other forms of civic engagement. So we've got the 2 elements here on the screen. On the left, who's in the room? So democratic lotteries recruit a microcosm of the public, sort of a city in one room, and reduce common barriers that many people face to participation. Then the deliberative process over on the right really changes how decisions get made by providing folks with ample time, balanced information to a group selected by lottery. We really create the conditions that folks need to come to common ground solutions. Now we'll spend the rest of the presentation kind of digging into these elements individually before talking about the Petaluma process itself. So beginning with the democratic lottery. And starting with our favorite metaphor, the democracy pies, which many of you have seen before, or some of you have. The vast majority of our current civic processes fall into one of these 2 categories: processes that are open to anyone, or processes that are open by a specific invitation. And we really just think there's one important slice of that democracy pie missing, which is processes that have been selected by democratic lottery, in which everyone has a chance to have a seat at the table for our most important pressing public decisions. Really, we're on the lookout for win-win solutions, so we don't have to divide up the same democracy pie. We can have more pies, and truly, each of these methods really has its benefits and drawbacks. So processes that are open to anyone, like voting and surveys, are important because they're super inclusive, but at least in theory, right? In practice, we know that it's often the same individuals who have the time and resources to show up to things like the city council meeting. Processes that are selected by special invitation are also incredibly important, especially to engage particular stakeholders or identity groups who experience differential impact. However, we see the same individuals here again getting tapped over and over to participate. Lottery selection is unique in that it can guarantee representation across a community's many diversities all at once and really gets new voices in the room. But of course, that requires time and design. So now we'll break the lottery into a couple different phases. So on the left, we begin by sending out invitation mailers to randomly selected residential addresses across a city or any location. Folks then who are available and interested can opt into participating and also send back a brief demographic form. And then we select many potential panels, all of which are demographically representative of that place. So typically the process convener, the city in this case, uses census data to select those demographic targets, including things like age, race and ethnicity, gender, geographic location, educational attainment, and others. And then a final panel is selected, often in a public event that's both random and representative of the general public on all of those different factors. And what makes it possible to recruit folks who are beyond the usual suspects is really removing as many barriers to participation as we possibly can. So panelists are paid a stipend that's equivalent to a living wage. They're reimbursed for expenses like travel and caregiving. They're provided comprehensive language access, one-on-one concierge services throughout the process so that everyone feels comfortable and welcome, and information purity, meaning that no one is expected to know about the topic when they enter the process, although panelists' lived experiences are also really valued alongside technical expertise. Now moving to that right side, what happens in the room, digging into the deliberative process. So before the process begins in stage 0 here, a convening authority will typically select the policy topic and then write the framing question for the panel to answer. And typically these processes are used for issues that are super complex and prone to lose-lose outcomes if left to business as usual. Then once the panel is seated in step 1, a process orientation is really designed to unlock the group's innate capacity for collaboration, for critical thinking, and awareness of intergroup dynamics. Members then go through an extensive learning phase together. They hear from often dozens of background presenters and stakeholders on all sides of an issue. They read briefing materials, they interrogate their own lived experiences with the topic, and they gather input from the broader community. And finally, in a process that typically lasts at least 4 full days, often much longer, and in the Petaluma case, it was 12, panelists deliberate in small groups that are professionally moderated and produce policy recommendations that are delivered directly to decision makers. So this model produces a number of benefits for policymakers. It really makes hard decisions easier. So by virtue of engaging with new voices, we expose fresh ideas along with areas of agreement. It surfaces kind of a representative public voice that gets beyond just organized interests who come in with existing positions. And it enhances mutual trust between governments and communities. From the public's vantage point, it fosters agency and ownership in our systems of governance, more than many people will feel in a lifetime. And it gives us hope that even in today's polarized world, it's still really possible to come together and find common ground with our neighbors on our toughest issues. This model has seen a huge amount of growth over the last 50 years around the world. There's now been over 700 documented cases. And while there's a long, many decades long history, we've seen what some have dubbed the deliberative wave crest in the last 15 years or so. And lottery selected democracy is happening truly all across the world and addressing most any policy topic, with planning and environmental topics being some of the most popular. So now that we've reviewed the nuts and bolts of this model, I want to dig deeper into the Fairgrounds Advisory Panel. This panel was a collaboration between the City of Petaluma and Healthy Democracy back in 2022. And as the practitioner organization, we led the democratic lottery and selected 36 residents that reflected Petaluma's population in terms of race and ethnicity, age, gender, location, educational attainment, housing status, and experience of a disability. The panel met for over 80 hours over the course of 2 months in the summer of 2022 to gather information, deliberate, and then make recommendations about the future of the fairgrounds property, as you've heard from Peggy. At the conclusion of the process, they presented their final proposals to the City Council and the Fair Board. And here we are during the first weekend. This is sort of the org chart for the project, with the panel seated at the center, reporting directly to decision makers, and stakeholders and community giving their input to the panel above. The Informational Advisory Committee over on the left was a group of stakeholders whose job it was to select presenters for the panel's learning phase to ensure that they heard well-balanced information. And now to briefly review the timeline here, the panel process formally began with City Council authorization, after which we sent out that 10,000 piece mailing to randomly selected residential addresses across town. We then conducted a public lottery event to kick off the project. And once the panel was seated, as I mentioned before, during their deliberative process, they moved through extensive learning. They wrote a guiding principles report. They prioritized site use options, and they finally recommended cohesive visions for the site. And they also continued to engage with the community and the city after delivering their recommendations. On the bottom row, you'll see stakeholder and public engagement. We see that Informational Advisory Committee and their process to curate background information for the panel, and then many opportunities for stakeholders and the public to give their input directly to the panel. So according to research by Dr. Marjan Isasi, who I think is in the audience today, who followed the Petaluma project very closely, the vast majority of panelists felt a growing sense of community with other panelists. They felt they had a say on the panel, and they believed that their input was meaningful and important in local decision-making. And finally, most of the panel's overarching recommendations had over 80% support from the broader community. So looking at a survey of about 226 community residents who didn't sit on the panel, we saw broad support for what the panel recommended. And lastly, to wrap us up, in the words of former Petaluma Mayor Teresa Barrett, it has been a huge commitment, and it was a big leap into another way of working together. This process seems to move to collaboration from competition, and I think that's the only way we move forward. So thank you so much. I'm happy to come back for questions if there are any about the nuts and bolts. And here's some information about where to find me and where to find more details about the project. And with that, I'll pass it back to Ramin to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Alex. And we'll make sure everyone has access to these links, and the recording from this will be made public as well. I think if we're in a room together, we would be giving you a round of applause. Alex, thank you very much for that concise and impactful presentation. So, to build on that, coming back to you, Peggy, bottom line, I'm sure many are curious, what impact did the panel work have on the issue and on the political dynamics that you were describing earlier?
Well, back to one of the panelists talking about taking the politics out of, the political conversation that this had been for over 50 years. It just built it just started a conversation, elevated a conversation that we hadn't had. And it was taken, without having city staff run this process, it built a lot of trust in the results. So when the panelists came up with their recommendations, it was easy. I think it was much easier for council, because they weren't picking sides. It kind of created this, like I said, it had been missing for a long time, and it wasn't special interest driven either by the city or the fair. And it was our community. It was our residents speaking. It just created and solidified the trust in the decisions that council was making for next steps. And it continues to serve right now as guiding principles for everything we do, from the negotiations with the fourth DAA all the way through to even how we're programming in the interim and before we go into our master planning. So it's set us on an amazing trajectory.
Amazing. So is it fair for me to read that as it kind of unstuck the issue from where it was?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. 100%.
Now, I think in different ways, as Alex was describing, to invest in this approach takes some amount of financial commitment in the city. And I'd say an average medium-sized one of these processes is about $250,000. I believe Petaluma's had, again, a few more bells and whistles in terms of accessibility and language translation, all very critical things, and it was longer. So that all said, was this a good ROI for Petalumans, or how do you think about the cost piece of this?
I think it has cost the city. I'm even thinking opportunity cost, but just, financially, it's cost the city a lot over the last 50 years of just wheels spinning, distrust, but staff having to work. If we had just done and I say typical, but I would say, and this isn't to be derogatory about a typical process, that we had a facilitator and, we had workshops, which we did anyways. We did those in tandem while the panel was deliberating. But had we just done that, it would have probably been a $500,000 effort, and we would still be where we were and bring World War III to council, right? That would have been the ultimate. It's like, okay, now we got to take it to council. We know what the two options are. It's either it's pro city or pro DAA, and it created this another level of consideration for council to say, wow, this isn't a city driven process. This is we're hearing straight from the community. And so it turned out.
The voice of the people prevented World War III, is what I heard in that. That's someone's.
Absolutely. I mean, it gave credibility to the process that we couldn't have done had this, no matter how the city had approached it in any other way. And it also took us out of the driver's seat, which for cities that are on here might feel a little uncomfortable, because I sure did for a time. I really wanted, it was like, oh, we got to be able to do the thing, or we got to be able to influence and I thought, now looking back, I'm so glad we didn't. But, there is a time where you're like, oh, I don't know what's happening, and wanting to have that and wanting to be able to guide that.
Yeah. Say a little bit more about that piece, because I imagine typically as a city manager, having the wheels on the bus and being in control of where things are going is a big part of the job,
Well, I laugh because everybody thinks that, the control lies with one person. It never does. Right. But it's knowing, running your process, right? Like making sure everybody's doing what they need to be doing. And this one, healthy democracy. I mean, even down to what Alex said about the concierge services, taking care, because we do a lot of that, right? At least our city does when it comes to public engagements. Like are we talking, do we need childcare? Do we need, wow, that room doesn't have good climate control. How are we, but healthy democracy did everything. And we would meet every so often, but it wasn't like, okay, so what should we be doing next? They already had it dialed in. And so there were the times that you went, but they need this information. I think the big urgency from everybody, or the big question from everybody when we were starting to develop this process was, well, but they're not experts in the field. They are not going to understand. Or I'm a council member and I'm the decision maker. And I said, well, it was flipping that narrative and saying, you still get to make the decision. This is just more information, right? You're going to be able to make much more informed decision making because we are pulling ourselves out of it. It isn't just a city driven process. And it's kind of the power of the people, government for the people, by the people. And let's walk the talk that we've been talking about for decades in local government about wanting to truly hear from our community.
Well, I'm going to ask just one more question, mindful of time, and then we will open it up to Q&A with any time that's left to the folks on the call. So please feel welcome to start putting things in the chat or raising your hands in the various ways. Here's my last question. So in a handful of cases around the world, these sorts of lottery-selected, democratic lottery-based assemblies have become a regular recurring feature of how people do governance and democracy. If you had a magic wand, how would you infuse assemblies as a regular part of local governance, either in Petaluma or Sonoma or the state level? You can go anywhere you want with this. You've got the magic wand.
I would just say that in this time of polarization, and I say worldwide, and distrust in government at an all-time low, right? Is the only way that we are going to turn the ship around is by bringing this process to those key conversations. I mean, whether it's your budget or land use, or I saw a ton of things in the chat and I went, yes, yes, yes. How we help our unhoused population, how we do business, how we show up for our community. And we spend a lot of time on committees and commissions, but wouldn't it be cool to have panels on all the hard community conversations and maybe some of the not so hard, just that it was some that seem fairly routine, but wouldn't that provide people that layer of trust or that ability to trust their government to do the right thing?
And to build on some of what you were saying earlier, that sense of agency reinvites their civic life.
Right.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to start reading off some questions from the chat. I believe the first one was for you, Alex, and Alex back. And this question comes from Desiree Jackson. And how do you ensure that people who are not selected panel are heard and their feedback is incorporated into the decision, discussion, and outcome?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I think it's a really important part of the process. And if you think back to the org chart that I shared, you saw that the community and stakeholders both had input into the panel process. And so in Petaluma, what we did a few broader community engagement opportunities, one of which actually Ramin facilitated, which was a community forum in which the first list of invitees were the folks who were invited to sit on the panel, but who weren't selected. So that was a great opportunity. The panel actually hosted that conversation and, were the table facilitators themselves in order to get broader community voices into the conversation. And we actually saw through a line, a couple of panelists in their final deliberations referenced that they got their ideas from that community forum. We did some surveys as well, and there are other ways of engaging those folks, but that's one great example from this project. Thank you.
I didn't know that detail. Thank you for sharing that, Alex. And then Dan Sells, basically a flavor, I guess, of my last question. He would love to know more about any additional assemblies that are planned in Petaluma or potentially could be planned. Where's this going?
Right. Well, and we have a new council since we did our last one. So we are talking about the timing for our charter amendments, and we actually need a whole rewrite of our charter. So to me, that's a beautiful opportunity for, because that's going to have to go to the vote of the people anyways. So what better way of bringing in our community and assembling a panel for that?
So a panel to take on the city charter, in effect, the constitution of the city.
Yes,
That's exciting.
it
That's
is. It is.
Zabre, I hope I'm pronouncing this name correctly. Valentine asks, love this example of targeted practical problem solving. I'm on an elections oversight commission for Alameda County. This is a long question. I'm going to see if I can. Zabre, should we bring you on to summarize this one? I would love to replace the.
You can skip it.
No. Why don't you summarize it? Yeah.
And I apologize. It's not like, it's more of a sort of like, would love to. I just think the Petaluma example is fantastic in that it's totally oriented around a very concrete, local problem that with clear options. And you just need to have the conversation and hear where people are. And that's the thing that needs to happen is when you had your epiphany talking to Healthy Democracy. And I think that applies in a lot of places that it could be deployed. We aren't. Someone just needs to do it, like so many things, right? And it's with this commission that we're on. I won't say any more about it here, other than there are so many things that come up that just need to be talked about, and people just need a design for that conversation to be able to share what they know and they think and they don't know and they want to know and and put it together. And the way our at local government, our methods for communicating have evolved in an effort to try to protect people, control, whatever the various reasons, really seriously just make a natural, productive conversation totally impossible. And I think we should stop, acknowledge that, and recognize that we can do it differently, and then do that. So, and we can point to you. Well said. Oh my gosh, well said. And Brown Act does make it so difficult, right? I mean, it just makes it so difficult to be able to have those conversations. So this is why I keep saying it is the missing piece of the pie.
Well, there are a number of great questions in the chat that unfortunately we're not going to have time to get to here. I will commit to taking the transcript though, and we can write up responses asynchronously and share it back because they're all great questions. One of them is a decent segue though. As I move to a close first, I again want to thank Peggy and Alex for this really powerful conversation and for your leadership in bringing this stuff to bear, where it's still, in the scheme of things, an emerging edge in terms of how we could do governance and democracy in the US. So hats off to you. We talked about forward-thinking leaders. Peggy, in my book, you are an archetype.
I couldn't do it without the support of this community. So big thanks to Healthy Democracy and American Public Trust and so many of you that do this work.
Well, so to build from there, I think many places might be asking, how can we bring this sort of stuff to our communities? And at the least, I want to highlight one program in partnership with Healthy Democracy to Public Trust is working to help 3 cities and or counties, excuse that, to each host 3 assemblies over the course of something like 3 years. We say 3 a lot. What we are organizing is matching grants from a host of donors across the political spectrum. And again, this is a nonpartisan innovation that would reduce some of the costs. Still looking again for matching, skin in the game from these jurisdictions, and then technical support in the design and delivery. Quite often that might look like Healthy Democracy coming to town and delivering the first one while we work together to build up local capacity with public engagement professionals and otherwise. And then over the course of it, we can co-design and imagine the best fit for an ongoing, regular, recurring role. We were starting to point to what might this look like as a permanent feature of local governance here. And through that, we can continue to demonstrate what's possible for the rest of the country and a different type of politics. So if you're interested in this, there will be a link, share it, that you can sign up for hearing more, basically. You can sign up to hear more. That link will also let you into hearing more about learning opportunities like this. So that is all I have to say. I will turn it to Alex and Peggy for any other closing thoughts.
Just deeply appreciate everyone for for being here today. Please feel free to reach out to me by email anytime if you have questions or want to continue the conversation. Healthy Democracy is a nonprofit, and part of our mission is just to spread the word about innovative, deliberative programs. And so don't hesitate to reach out just to be a thought partner. I'll put my email again in the chat.
And I would just echo what Alex said, just super grateful to have this opportunity to share. But I also serve as a resource and happy to be a thought partner for anybody who's city manager and local government. Happy to talk and help you strategize. So thank you. Thanks, Ramin.
Thank you, everyone. All right. We did it. We even finished 2 minutes early. Please enjoy a moment of fresh air between your next Zoom calls. Thank you for being here with us.